Roberts.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ms Bligh, for participating today. You mentioned that because of commercial decisions, this doesn't warrant. There's not a need for consultation. It doesn't warrant consultation. Let me remind you that I think banks should be commercial. So let's remove all of the Big Four's many legislated advantages. Let's remove the fact that they were given $180 billion from the RBA with interest payments interest rates as low as 0.1%, and then relented back to the RBA at up to 4.1%. They made a lot of money for minimal risk. Then we look at things like bank bail-in, legislated. If the bank makes a mistake, they can take money off customers and convert it to worthless shares. The past bank, the props that the government has given, government guarantees for things like overseas borrowing. The Four Pillars itself enshrines the banks with less competition, the Big Four banks. There's a more generous treatment of the Big Four banks from APRA, for example, in risk weighting. The legislation, the extensively complicated legislation provides barriers to entry for smaller banks. There's a complexity of legislation that provides a barrier against prosecution of the banks because it's just so damn hard to prosecute them. They dominate the cash distribution network. These are all legislated and regulated. And then essentially what we've got now is a low-risk business for the Big Four banks and sticky customers who won't fly away when they shut down a branch. So we've got the banks are guaranteed in security by the national community. Surely the banks owe a service to the national community. Surely the banks have a community service obligation to keep their services going. This cash, is critical for many people. The banks have admitted today they don't know, they haven't got a clue how much cash circulates between their customers. So customers are telling us quite clearly that the crux of this inquiry is the need to maintain cash and the need to maintain access to banks. The banks have a community service obligation.
Senator, I would probably disagree with you on most of the points that you've made. I think you've drawn your own conclusions in relation to a number of these things which, frankly, I don't think are borne out in fact. I just say a couple of things. Firstly, I'm very proud of this country. I'm very proud of the way that our regulators and our governments of both political persuasions rose up and were prepared to take extraordinary measures when we were under periods of extraordinary threat, whether it was the GFC or a global pandemic. And I think every Australian felt proud that we didn't stand by and let our economy fall over or collapse. We took extraordinary decisions for extraordinary times. It's easy to sit back in hindsight and say, well, were they all perfect? Just like JobSeeker? No, probably not. But when you're in the middle of a crisis, what I expect of my governments as a taxpayer and as a citizen is that they will do their absolute best to keep me and my family and my community safe. And that's what I saw during the pandemic, and it's what I saw during the GFC. So all of those provisions that were put in place to make sure that Australian banks and their customers did not fall over, all of those provisions, and those provisions were not only made for the four major banks, they were made for every bank, large and small, and customers were the beneficiaries. Those decisions were made so that credit could flow to small businesses so they wouldn't collapse at a time of potential national catastrophe. So, as I said, I'm very proud as a citizen to have had governments in this country of all persuasions that have done the right thing when the right thing needed to be done. In relation to the Four Pillars legislation, Four Pillars legislation actually maintains competition between at least four pillars. Without it, they'd be able to take each other over and we would actually see less competition. So the Four Pillars legislation is not about lessening competition, it's about ensuring that competition is not reduced by the ability for one or more of the Big Four to take each other over. On the question of cash, I absolutely agree with you. Cash is important. And it will continue to be important. And what I heard from all of the CEOs this morning is that they agree that there has to be consideration given to how we can ensure those people who need cash can get it as it becomes a less and less significant part of the payment system by volume. What I also heard CEOs were saying, not that they have no idea how much cash is in circulation. The RBA tracks that. We know how much cash is in circulation. What they don't know is what people are spending it on and if they're spending it. We know that in some cases, some people, for all kinds of reasons, like to have cash that they keep at home. It gives them a sense of security, and that's perfectly legitimate. So we know how much cash is in circulation. Banks can see how much cash their customers are taking out from their ATMs. We see the RBA surveys, and nobody is disputing that cash is important. Nobody is disputing that cash is necessary. What they're saying is it's less necessary and less used than it was 5 years ago and 10 years ago. And in 5, 10 and 15 years' time, there's going to be less of it. I don't hear any bank talking about cashless society, but I do hear them talking about a society with less cash. And in an environment of less cash, what do we have to be thinking about now to make sure that those companies, for example, that transport cash, do that on a commercial basis, at what point might that become difficult or unviable? And what do we need to be thinking about to ensure that Australians who need cash can access it?
Ms Bligh, are you proud of the fact that no senior executive, as a result of the heinous crimes that were exposed in the Hayne Royal Commission, not one senior executive, as far as I know, was jailed, not one senior executive was fined? We've now got a legislation gone through the Parliament saying there's no need for fines, so there's no accountability individually for executives, there's no accountability for the banks. We've also got essentially, we've got many mums and dads buying shares in the banks, but all four of the major banks in this country have controlling interests from people like Vanguard, BlackRock, Vanguard Investments, State Street, First State, and other associated entities from those four companies, four funds. We've essentially got one bank with four logos operating as four divisions. Their products are almost identical, their services are almost identical, their terms and conditions are almost identical. They operate as one, they have it sewn up. The directors appoint the executives, and the executives are beholden to the directors. We've got the same shareholders taking interest in Qantas, and look where that's going. All the other banks need, the smaller banks need, is a fair go. That's all. And what we need as a community is to have a fair go. Surely you're not going to endorse what I've just said, what I've just said as being wrong.
All of the things that you've said, firstly, all the regulation that you've referred to applies across all of the banks in this country, regardless of whether they are large or small. And I totally agree with the evidence given to the committee by Mike Lawrence that we need to take a much more proportionate view on whole areas of regulation in relation to the size and complexity of the businesses. There are not only small banks in Mike Lawrence's membership, but there are quite small banks in the ABA membership. And a level playing field is a really important part of a competitive banking system. So we certainly endorse the UK regulatory grid as a way to have much more carefully thought through regulations and its implications for banks, and taking into account their size, their complexity, and the risk that any problem there might pose to the system. And I'm very sorry, Senator, but you said so many different things. I think that probably I take that particular one on board. I think what we do have in this country, we've got 129 authorised deposit institutions. 96 of them are banks. There's a bank out there with a shape and a size for every customer. And they offer very different products. They are regulated in the same way. So, yes, you will see similarities because that's what regulation is designed to do. When it comes to accountability, I think you've been part of a parliament that's just recently passed an accountability regime that imposes obligations and consequences on the senior executives of banks that I'm not aware of existing anywhere outside of financial services. So do banks hold a special place in the community? Yes, they have a licence to hold other people's money, and they have an obligation to do that in ways that is with due care and thought, and they do that in different ways depending on the shape and the size of the bank.
Let me just point out that the financial accountability regime went through without any accountability. No accountability, that was missing. So, and are you aware of the original Commonwealth Bank? The original Commonwealth Bank saw the growth of Australia, saw us going through the First World War with no debt. We saw a dramatic improvement in accountability because of the People's Bank that the original Commonwealth Bank was. So we saw a People's Bank that grew dramatically because it offered a competitive and fair alternative to the private banks. We also saw enormous accountability enter the banking sector because of the Commonwealth Bank. And then we saw the private banks, through both sides of politics, destroy the Commonwealth Bank. And so what I'm saying now is we need a People's Bank. Where do you stand on a People's Bank?
Well, I don't think that anyone has succeeded in destroying the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. It's one of the strongest banks on the planet.
Destroyed it as a People's Bank, Ms Bligh. Destroyed it as a People's Bank. The Commonwealth Bank exists now, but it's just another retail bank. It's no longer a People's Bank.
What do you mean by People's Bank, Senator?
Owned by the people, owned by the government.
Public bank.
Public bank.
Okay. Well, all I know is that state-owned financial institutions in this country have not had a great history. I'm only aware of them being successful in countries like Russia and China. As a taxpayer, would be pretty wary about buying, as Australian taxpayers, buying back into banks or financial institutions when we have a thriving banking community that says there's a bank out there for everybody, whether it's the little bank that's got 20 staff that's located in its own little community and is well known, or whether it is something as big as Westpac or Commonwealth Bank and everything in between.
Are you aware of the state bank?
Sorry, Senator Roberts. No, sorry, I'm going to have to cut you off. You've had more